My son reached me on a Tuesday morning. The line was clear, sharp enough to catch the ambient noise of an airport terminal humming in the background. "Dad," he said, his voice pitched at that breezy, unbothered register he always deployed when he was trying to paper over some enormous failure. "We relocated to another state last week, Nashville, Tennessee. We forgot to mention it, actually." I was standing in the middle of my kitchen phone pressed to my ear. 5 seconds of silence. I let the sheer nerve of what he'd just said settle over me. You don't uproot an entire household, a pregnant wife, every possession you own, and chalk it up to a thing that simply slipped your mind. I didn't raise my voice. No demands. No interrogation about why his father was being quietly written out of their lives. I said only, "All right, son, good luck." Then I set down the phone, crossed into my study, lifted the laptop lid, and fired off an email to my attorney with a very particular attachment included. "Welcome back to Dad Revenge, a place where real stories of betrayal, resilience, and justice find their voice. If this is your first time here, I'm glad you found us, and I hope you'll stay close by following along for more stories like this one." Before we go any further, are you listening on headphones right now or through a speaker? It matters because what you're about to hear deserves your full attention. One quick note. Some elements of this story have been dramatized for the purpose of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is entirely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. I'm a man who understands data complex systems and absolute security. I built my entire life on recognizing dangerous patterns and neutralizing catastrophic risks before they could metastasize. And yet the gravest threat to everything I'd constructed had been seated at my dinner table, eating the food I put there for the better part of a decade. The phone call from my 38-year-old son, Colton, was the spark that lit up a very dark room, we forgot to tell you. Those 5 words hung in the absolute quiet of my house like smoke, an insult dressed up as a passing afterthought. As I moved down the long carpeted hallway toward my private home office, the preceding 8 months replayed behind my eyes with razor-sharp clarity. 8 months earlier, Colton and his wife Priya had settled onto my imported French linen sofa, nursing my expensive bourbon and painting a flawless portrait of future family happiness. Priya had rested a manicured hand on her gently rounded stomach and looked at me with tears rising in her eyes. "We want to raise the baby right here in Ohio," she had whispered, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "Close to you, Victor. We want him to grow up knowing his grandfather. But our house in the suburbs needs so much work. It needs a new nursery, a complete structural overhaul to make it safe, and the contractors are demanding a fortune." I remembered the precise weight of my platinum fountain pen as I signed that check. $2.5 million. An absurd figure for a suburban renovation, but I had the liquid capital, and they knew it. My late wife, Elaine, had passed away 4 years prior. She had always dreamed of a home filled with the noise and laughter of grandchildren. Her absence had carved a silent void in my life, a vulnerability that Colton and Priya had expertly learned to exploit. I wrote that check believing I was laying the cornerstone of our family's future. I was securing a place for my grandchild. I handed over a literal fortune on the strength of a plausible lie that they were planting permanent roots right here in my city. Now Colton was standing in an airport in Tennessee, casually letting it slip that they had fully relocated to Nashville. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. The sheer disrespect landed like a physical blow. But I did not allow my emotions to cloud my judgment. At my core, I am a software engineer. When a system throws a fatal error, you do not sit down and weep. You isolate the breach and you audit the code. I stepped into my home office and turned the lock on the heavy oak door. The room was completely soundproof, lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, holding decades of technical manuals, patents, and corporate ledgers. I crossed to the third bookshelf on the left, reached behind a vintage set of leather-bound legal volumes, and pressed the hidden release switch. The heavy wooden shelf swung open silently on custom hinges, exposing the cold steel face of my wall. Safe. I had not touched this safe in months. There had been no reason to. It held my most vital, irreplaceable physical documents. The original deeds to my commercial properties, My corporate succession plans, a notarized backup copy of the 2.5 million check I'd given Colton, and most critically, my medical power of attorney. That particular document had been drafted years ago, granting Colton the legal authority to make medical and financial decisions on my behalf, only in the extreme circumstance that I was fully incapacitated and unable to speak for myself. I set my hand against the cold steel dial. I spun it left, then right, feeling the familiar heavy mechanical clicks beneath my fingertips. 42, 18, 55. I pulled the handle down hard. The solid locking bolts retracted with a deep, satisfying thud, and the thick steel door swung wide. I reached into the dark cavity, expecting to find the familiar stack of thick manila legal folders. My hand found empty air. I froze. I pulled back slightly, blinking, and switched on the small pewter desk lamp nearby, directing its harsh light straight into the safe's interior. It was bare. Every inch of the shelf had been swept clean. The backup copy of the $2.5 million check was gone. The corporate succession plans were gone. My medical power of attorney was gone. A cold leaden knot formed deep in my gut, sending an icy current through my veins. To get inside this safe, someone would have needed the exact numerical combination and the physical key to the inner security drawer. I never wrote that combination down. I never gave the key to another soul. Then my mind snapped back to an afternoon a few weeks prior. Priya had appeared unannounced, claiming she wanted to help tidy my office because the dust aggravated my allergies. She had insisted on wiping down the bookshelves while I was tied up on a long business call in the kitchen. She had been alone in this soundproof room for nearly an hour. She had watched me open that safe once before, years ago. She must have memorized the dial sequence and made an impression of the key I kept tucked in my desk. As I stood staring into the hollow, steel box, absorbing the full terrifying scale of the violation, my cell phone erupted in my pocket. The sudden mechanical vibration jolted me in the dead silence of the office. I pulled it out and read the screen. It was an automated high-priority alert from my primary wealth management bank. The message read, "Security alert. Your primary mailing address and account control contact have been successfully changed to an address in Nashville, Tennessee. If you did not authorize this change, please contact our fraud department immediately." I read those glowing lines twice, making sure I was grasping the full shape of what was unfolding. They had not merely stolen my money under false pretenses. They had not simply walked off with my sensitive legal documents. They were actively working to commandeer my entire financial identity across state lines. I shut the safe door with a sharp, echoing click. I walked to my desk, settled into my leather chair, opened the laptop, and began to type. My son believed he was dealing with a grieving, oblivious old man. He believed he could cart off my legacy and strip away my autonomy without my ever catching on. But he forgot who had actually built the wealth he was so frantically trying to steal. I was the architect of my own empire, and it was time to run a complete system purge. I sat in the glow of the laptop screen, the banking alert seared into my retinas. Nashville, Tennessee. The full magnitude of the deception settled over me, cold and suffocating. They were not merely taking my money. This was a calculated, hostile attempt to take over my life entirely. My mind, ordinarily a fortress of logic and order, began running back through the previous 6 months with agonizing frame-by-frame precision. The warning signs had been there the whole time, tucked in plain sight, wrapped in the smothering disguise of filial devotion. It began shortly after I tweaked my knee in a minor winter slip on the driveway. Priya had practically taken up residence in the guest suite, insisting that Colton was far too consumed by his corporate responsibilities to look after me properly. She commandeered the kitchen. She took over my schedule. Most critically, she absorbed herself into my daily routine. I could still hear the exact pitch of her voice, saccharine saturated with manufactured concern bouncing off the kitchen walls. "Victor, you really need to start taking better care of yourself," she had murmured one evening, sliding a small ceramic dish across the granite countertop. Inside sat 3 large, chalky white pills. "These are special memory supplements. My holistic nutritionist swears by them completely. They support cognitive longevity and help with daily stress." I swallowed them without a moment's hesitation. Why would a father question the woman carrying his future grandchild? But the timeline fit together with terrible precision. The weeks following the introduction of her daily supplements dissolved into a blur of uncharacteristic, humiliating incompetence. I, a man who once held complex logistical algorithms in his head without effort, began losing track of the simplest things. I would walk into the kitchen and stand there unable to remember why I'd come. I would spend hours hunting for my car keys, cycling through the same rooms with mounting dread. My speech would occasionally slur in evening conversation, my tongue thick and sluggish, refusing my own instructions. I felt like a man trapped behind glass inside his own deteriorating body, watching his faculties dissolve in real time. And Priya was always present, always drifting at the edge of my vision. I remembered the soft, deliberate click of her smartphone camera. Every time I stumbled over an ordinary word, every time I pressed my fingers to my temples, in bewildered frustration, her phone happened to be angled straight at me. "Oh, Dad, you're just so adorable today." She would laugh softly, tapping the screen. "I'm just grabbing a quick video to show Colton how cute you get when you're tired." It was not adorable. It was not a playful moment between family. It was the cold, methodical documentation of a man in artificial decline. She was assembling a digital record of deterioration she had engineered herself. That realization struck me with the force of a freight train leaving the rails. The thick fog that had smothered my mind for months evaporated instantly, scorched away by a sudden overwhelming surge of pure adrenaline. I shoved my heavy leather chair back and got to my feet. I left the soundproof study and moved swiftly down the hallway toward the kitchen. They had packed up their lives in a conspicuously frantic hurry, leaving several large black garbage bags heaped carelessly near the garage entrance. Wealthy people rarely bother hauling out their own trash when they are busy fleeing a crime scene. I had no interest in the mess itself. I tore into the heavy plastic bags, both hands tearing through discarded takeout containers, junk mail, and the ordinary wreckage of a hasty departure. I was hunting for the source of my sudden, inexplicable deterioration. I ripped open the second bag, the sharp reek of spoiled food, meaning nothing to me, my eyes sweeping frantically for anything connected to her daily, holistic regimen. Near the very bottom, wedged between a crumpled trade journal and a shattered ceramic bowl, I found what I was looking for. A crushed cardboard box holding a foil blister pack. The packaging carried no standard pharmaceutical branding whatsoever. No cheerful logo, no friendly dosage instructions, just a stark alphanumeric code stamped in plain black ink on the back of the foil. 3 empty slots, the exact number of pills she had pressed into my hand on her very last day in this house. I gripped the blister pack so hard the jagged foil edge cut into my thumb. I walked straight back to my study, the dirt on my hands irrelevant. I dropped into my chair at the mahogany desk and opened a heavily encrypted browser, bypassing commercial search engines entirely. I fed that cold string of letters and numbers into a restricted global pharmaceutical database. The results came up immediately, filling the high-definition screen with dense clinical literature. I read through the chemical composition. I read through the listed applications. I did not find a holistic vitamin. I did not find an organic memory supplement. What I found was a heavy, tightly regulated neurosuppressant, a potent chemical compound used almost exclusively in high-security psychiatric facilities to subdue violent, unmanageable patients. A drug requiring 3 separate physician signatures to legally prescribe in this state. The severe side effects were printed in bold red text on my screen. Severe short-term memory loss, extreme motor function impairment, slurred speech, chronic lethargy, severe cognitive detachment. A clinical profile that perfectly mimicked the aggressive onset of early dementia. I sat in the silence of my study and stared at the medical description of my own poisoning. My daughter-in-law had not been looking after me. She had been chemically lobotomizing me at my own dining table, and Colton, my flesh and blood, the boy I had proudly taught to ride a bicycle, the man whose entire corporate career I had bankrolled, had stood by and allowed it. He had smiled at me across the dinner table while his wife fed me a daily dose of chemical erasure. They were not simply after my financial assets. They were deliberately, methodically dismantling my mind to ensure I could never mount any resistance to their endgame. They needed me passive. They needed me compliant. They needed a court to look at me and see a man no longer fit to manage his own affairs. The casual videos on her phone were never warm family keepsakes. They were carefully assembled exhibits intended for a future courtroom. Evidence to strip away my fundamental rights. I drew a slow, measured breath. The white-hot fury inside me was no longer a wildfire. It had condensed into something glacial cold, immovable, and absolute. I needed to establish the precise timeline of their departure. I needed to see exactly what they had physically removed from this house the night before they vanished to Tennessee. I swiveled away from my laptop toward the secondary workstation positioned at the far end of my large desk. That terminal ran a direct hardwired connection to the sophisticated home security mainframe I had personally designed and built from scratch. High-definition night vision cameras covered every entry point to the garage and the main living areas. I needed the raw footage. I needed to watch their faces as they robbed me in the middle of the night. I entered my complex master administrator credentials. The system verified and cleared my login. I navigated to the master directory holding the surveillance archives for the past 72 hours. But as my cursor hovered over the primary video file, the entire interface locked up cold. A command prompt window materialized in the center of the monitor without warning. The familiar blue interface bled into a harsh warning red. Lines of malicious code began cascading down the screen at speed. I recognized the script immediately. It was a military-grade deletion protocol engineered to permanently scrub hard drives and overwrite every sector with randomized data. They had planted a digital bomb to bury their tracks. The screen blinked once and rendered a final message in bold white letters across the darkened glass. Files corrupted. Wipe initiated. I read those words a second time. Files corrupted. Wipe initiated. A grim, almost predatory stillness settled through me. My son had executed this with meticulous precision. He had either retained expensive professionals or acquired high-end software specifically to scour the local network drives, making certain the footage of his midnight theft was gone for good. Colton always had a sharp mind for aggressive corporate tactics. He understood complex acquisitions, hostile takeovers, the efficient liquidation of valuable assets. But Colton had made one catastrophic miscalculation about the man whose empire he was so casually attempting to plunder. Long before I founded a multi-million-dollar logistics corporation, long before I wore custom suits and presided over gleaming boardrooms, I was a senior network security architect. I personally wrote the code that shielded global corporate supply chains from elite international hackers. I did not install a standard consumer-grade security system in this house. I engineered it from the ground up to be impenetrable. I pushed my keyboard aside and reached beneath the solid wooden surface of my desk. My fingers found the small recessed metal panel concealed out of sight. I flipped the physical toggle. The primary monitor went dark. The corrupted local drive was cut off from the display entirely. I pulled a secure physical token drive from my suit pocket and slotted it into a hidden secondary port. The screen flickered back to life, bypassing the compromised local network and opening a direct channel to a deeply buried, air-gapped, mirrored cloud server. I had personally embedded the hardware for this redundant backup system into the solid concrete foundation during the home's original construction. It recorded on a continuous, unbreakable loop, completely invisible to the home wireless network, absolutely immune to remote wipe commands. My arrogant son had successfully torched the decoy, never once grasping that the real vault was buried in the ground beneath his feet. I cleared the security firewall, entered my biometric passcodes, and brought up the master directory. The pristine, uncorrupted, high-definition video files populated the screen in clean chronological order. I scrolled to the primary security feed from my private study, time-stamped exactly 48 hours ago. One hurrah in the morning. The infrared camera captured the heavy oak door swinging slowly open. Colton and Priya slipped into the room with the cold, practiced efficiency of seasoned professional thieves. I watched my own son, the boy I had walked directly to my hidden wall. Safe. No pause. No hesitation. No searching for a combination he hadn't memorized. He simply drew a small folded piece of paper from his pocket and spun the dial with calm, practiced precision. He slid in a copied key and pulled the heavy steel door open wide. My chest contracted painfully as I watched him reach inside and extract the thick manila folders holding my most sensitive legal documents one by one. Priya stood near the desk, holding a heavy brown cardboard box open. She began loading my confidential medical files into it with quick, efficient movements, brisk, entirely unhesitating. I reached forward and pushed the audio amplification to maximum. The parabolic microphones locked onto their hushed voices with piercing clarity. Colton stopped briefly, my medical power of attorney held between his hands. He looked down at the document for a long moment, then lifted his eyes to his pregnant wife. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" he asked, his voice quiet, betraying the faintest trace of something that might once have been a conscience. "Once we submit these papers, there's absolutely no turning back. We are legally trapping him forever." Priya didn't even glance up from the cardboard box she was methodically packing. She released a soft, deeply venomous laugh that turned my blood cold. "Colton, please," she scoffed, tossing another vital folder into the box, without ceremony. "He's a clueless old fossil. The daily sedative is already working perfectly. He can barely string 2 sentences together after dinner. He won't know he's completely ruined until the state comes to collect him. By the time he grasps what has actually happened, we'll hold full legal control of the entire estate, and he'll be locked away in some sterile memory care ward." I sat utterly motionless in my leather chair. The cold blue light of the monitor laid bare the absolute destruction of my family. They weren't simply stealing my money. They weren't merely seizing control of my company. They were orchestrating a permanent legal kidnapping with deliberate malicious precision. They intended to weaponize the courts against me using the fabricated dementia they had chemically induced to have me declared incompetent and forcibly committed to a psychiatric facility, against my will. My own son was preparing to sign the paperwork to have me confined for the remainder of my life purely to accelerate his inheritance. The calculating evil embedded in their scheme was breathtaking in its scope. A hostile, merciless takeover of my very existence. The powerful sedative was the linchpin of their entire operation. They needed a legitimate medical paper trail to justify their extreme actions. They needed documented clinical evidence of a sudden, rapid cognitive collapse. If I could obtain a certified blood test immediately, I could prove in a court of law that I was being actively poisoned with unauthorized dangerous neurosuppressants. I could demolish their fabricated medical narrative and have them arrested for criminal assault before they executed their final move. I had to act with speed. The toxic compounds were likely already clearing my system, given that they had stopped administering the pills the moment they bolted for Tennessee. I reached for my desk phone and dialed the private direct line of my longtime personal physician, Dr. Culver. He was the only medical professional I trusted without reservation. The line rang twice before his head receptionist, a kind woman who had known me personally for over 15 years, picked up. "Dr. Culver's office, this is Donna speaking. How may I help you today?" I kept my voice perfectly measured, deliberately holding back the mounting urgency pressing against my ribs. "Donna, this is Victor Harmon. I need an emergency appointment with the doctor today. I need a comprehensive toxicology screening and a full metabolic blood panel drawn as quickly as possible." A long, deeply uncomfortable silence settled over the line. The pause stretched out thick with confusion. When Donna finally responded, her voice was hesitant, nervous, and utterly bewildered. "Mr. Harmon, I'm so confused. Your son contacted our office directly exactly 3 months ago. He transferred your entire medical history and all of your active prescriptions to a new primary care clinic down in Nashville, Tennessee. He stated that you were relocating there permanently for specialized cognitive treatment at a private facility. He told us explicitly that you were no longer capable of overseeing your own health care, and he submitted paperwork to that effect." I did not panic. I simply reached across and severed the power line to the compromised terminal, dropping that half of the room into darkness. They had covered their digital tracks with the precision of a corporate sabotage unit, but they had fundamentally misjudged the playing field we were on. I picked up my personal secure mobile phone and scrolled past my standard contacts to a number I kept reserved strictly for existential threats. Warren Falk was not the kind of attorney you retained to review a vendor contract or draft a routine will. He was a ruthless, brilliant tactician who operated exclusively in the high-stakes territories of commercial litigation and hostile corporate takeovers. a man who understood the architecture of power and how to dismantle it. When he came through my front door at exactly 2 mantra in the morning, he carried no trace of a man roused from sleep. He was sharp, alert, and gripping a heavy leather briefcase that likely held enough legal firepower to bankrupt a small nation. I walked him directly into my study, locked the heavy oak door behind us, and sealed the room for the conversation that needed to happen. No tears, no emotional collapse. I did not ask him how a father endures the complete betrayal of his only son. Instead, I placed the crushed blister pack of neurosuppressants on the desk beside a printed hard copy of the server logs, showing the precise moment the wiping protocol had been triggered. I laid out the situation with the clinical detachment of an auditor, delivering a loss report. I described the sudden relocation to Tennessee. I detailed the theft of the medical power of attorney. I walked him through the entire sequence of events with cold, unsparing clarity, leaving no opening for ambiguity. Every word was a calculated blow against the fiction of my perfect family. Warren listened without interrupting, his sharp eyes moving between the pill packaging and the printed data. When I finished, he opened his briefcase and produced a secure, encrypted laptop. No hollow reassurances, no condolences. He simply asked for the precise date and routing number of the $2.5 million check I had written to Colton for the purported home renovations. I retrieved the figures from my secure banking portal. Warren opened a series of restricted property databases, his fingers working across the keys, with practiced predatory efficiency, hunting for the digital footprints they had left behind in their rush to execute their scheme. For 15 minutes, the only sound in the soundproof study was the rapid click of keystrokes. Then Warren stopped. He turned the laptop screen to face me. The document on the display was a property deed filed in Davidson County, Tennessee. It was for a sprawling, ultra-modern luxury estate in one of the most exclusive gated communities in Nashville. The purchase price was listed at exactly $2.4 million. The transaction had been completed entirely in cash just 3 days after my check cleared Colton's account, but Colton's name appeared nowhere on the deed. The property was registered to a newly formed limited liability company called Crestlane Holdings. I studied the screen, working through the corporate registry documents attached to the deed. The sole managing member and registered agent of Crestlane Holdings was Priya. My daughter-in-law had taken my money, cut my son out of the legal paperwork entirely, and acquired a massive Tennessee estate under her exclusive control. The renovation story had been a fabrication from the first word. They had never planned to stay in Cleveland. They had never intended to build a nursery in a suburban home. They had engineered this cross-country escape over months, financing their new life with my money while poisoning me at my own table to neutralize any possibility of a fight back. The level of cold-blooded deception executed with the precision of seasoned criminals, utterly devoid of conscience, was staggering. Warren didn't stop there. He leaned back over the keyboard, his expression tightening into a mask of focused intensity. "If they went to the trouble of stealing your physical power of attorney," he murmured, his eyes moving rapidly across multiple database windows, "they aren't stopping at a simple cash grab. That document is a blank check for total financial control across state lines. I need to run a full diagnostic on your commercial real estate portfolio right now. Your liquid assets sit behind a biometric firewall, but your physical properties could be dangerously exposed. They could leverage those buildings for substantial capital without your knowledge, triggering a cascade of catastrophic debt." I watched him work, the glacial anger in my chest growing denser with every passing minute. Over 30 years, I had assembled a substantial portfolio of prime commercial real estate in the downtown district office buildings, high-end retail spaces, large warehouses generating a steady, reliable stream of passive income. Those properties were the bedrock of my wealth, wholly separate from my logistics software company, the tangible legacy I had spent a lifetime intending to pass on. Now they stood potentially exposed to a stolen piece of paper. I would not allow them to dismantle everything I had built and drag my reputation through the wreckage of their greed. The silence in the room thickened as Warren cross-referenced public records, Davidson County liens and federal banking registries, searching for any unauthorized encumbrances or transfers of ownership. The meticulous thoroughness of his search was a stark reminder of how vast the empire I had constructed was, and how grave the danger it now faced. Every passing second felt like an eternity as I waited for the digital verdict. I kept my breathing measured, refusing to let the mounting tension crack my composure. I had faced hostile takeovers before, but never from my own blood. This was an entirely different category of warfare, demanding a new order of strategic ruthlessness and absolute unblinking resolve. Then his fingers went still. He stared at the screen for a long, agonizing beat. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving him pale and visibly shaken in a way I had never witnessed. The ambient hum of the encrypted laptop felt deafening in the sudden stillness of the room. He drew a slow breath and finally raised his eyes to mine. His dark gaze locked onto me, carrying a level of shock I'd never seen in him before. His voice, ordinarily so commanding, was tightly controlled and profoundly grim. "Victor," he said, selecting each word with terrifying deliberateness. "They didn't just take the $2.5 million using your stolen power of attorney. They have leveraged the entirety of your downtown commercial real estate portfolio for a $10 million cash loan." The silence inside my soundproof study was shattered by the bright, cheerful ring of my cell phone. The screen lit up the dark, polished wood of my desk. An incoming video call, my son's name on the display. Warren paused his typing and looked up at me, his sharp eyes narrowing into a look of absolute silent warning. We had just uncovered the $10 million fraudulent loan. The raw, bleeding wound of their betrayal was completely fresh, burning with cold, volatile intensity. And yet at this precise moment, they were calling to perform their roles in the elaborate theatrical fiction they had so carefully constructed. I didn't answer immediately. I took 3 long, deliberate breaths, coaxing my racing pulse into a slow, controlled rhythm. I had spent 30 years dismantling ruthless corporate predators. I knew exactly how to bury my true intentions behind a perfectly neutral expression. But this was not a business rival. This was my own flesh and blood. I reached over and dimmed the small pewter desk lamp, drawing my face into deep, forgiving shadow. I let my shoulders cave forward, deliberately collapsing my posture into the fragile, defeated shape of a broken old man. I softened my jaw, let my eyes cloud over with manufactured confusion, and pressed the green button. The high-definition screen flickered to life, filling with the bright, smiling faces of Colton and Priya. "Hey, Dad," Colton said with a cheerful warmth that turned my stomach false and carefully produced. "We just wanted to call and check in. We're getting settled into the new place." I studied the digital image of my only son. I searched his face for any trace of guilt, any hairline fracture in the surface of his performance. There was nothing. His eyes were clear and utterly empty of remorse. I noticed the background was deliberately tight, in frame, a plain, unremarkable beige wall, bearing a single cheap-looking framed print of a coastal seascape. A calculated camera angle engineered to conceal the sweeping luxury of the multi-million-dollar Tennessee estate my stolen money had purchased. "It's just a modest little rental, Victor," Priya offered her, voice saturated with the same artificial sweetness she'd used when pressing black market sedatives into my palm. "Nothing fancy, but safe and comfortable for the baby while we find our footing down here. How are you feeling today? Did you remember to eat breakfast?" The sheer audacity of the question nearly shattered my facade. She was checking whether the chemical fog from her toxic regimen still held me. She was probing my defenses for any flicker of clarity or resistance. I let my mouth fall open slightly. I blinked several times in rapid, exaggerated succession, faithfully reproducing the profound disorientation I had genuinely suffered just weeks earlier under her poisonous care. I think so," I mumbled, letting the words blur and trail off into a weak, uncertain whisper. I'm very tired today. The house feels so big and empty without you both here." "Oh, we miss you too, Dad," Colton replied smoothly, his tone wrapped in thick, condescending pity. "We'll come up and visit as soon as we can. Just focus on resting. Keep those stress levels down." I leaned closer to the camera, widening my eyes to project helpless panic, letting my hand tremble visibly as I raised it to my forehead. "Colton, I can't find my checkbook," I stammered, my voice breaking on the final syllable. "I've looked everywhere for it. Did I leave it in the kitchen before you left? I need to pay the utility bills." But my mind is just, it's completely blank today. I can't remember where I've put anything. I watched the screen with the focused stillness of a hawk. For one fleeting fraction of a second, their polished masks slipped. Priya turned her head toward Colton. A sharp, triumphant smirk crossed her lips, a look of pure, unguarded victory. She genuinely believed her chemical assault had permanently dismantled my mind. She believed I was sitting alone in Cleveland, utterly helpless, groping around for a paper checkbook while they were actively draining $10 million from my commercial real estate holdings. Colton smoothed his own smug satisfaction behind a deeply patronizing smile. "Dad, don't worry about the bills," he said, speaking to me as though I were a bewildered child. "I told you before we left, I have everything handled. The automatic payments are all set up so you don't need to stress your brain over the finances anymore. Just relax and let us carry the weight." "You are such a good boy, Colton," I whispered, pushing a fragile, grateful smile onto my face while a silent inferno raged behind my eyes. "I just get so terribly confused lately." "It's okay, Victor," Priya said softly. "We're managing the transition. Colton actually has to head out right now for a dull introductory networking event for local logistics managers. We're trying to build something from the ground up down here." "That's right," Colton added quickly, straightening his collar. "Just pressing the flesh, trying to line up some basic consulting work to keep the lights on in this little rental. We'll call you tomorrow. Get some rest, Dad." "I will," I murmured softly. "Good luck with your seminar, son." The screen went dark as they cut the connection. I dropped the act instantly, spine straight, jaw set. I turned back to Warren, who was watching me with an expression of quiet, profound respect. We had just witnessed the full depth of their depravity in real time. At that moment, the secondary encrypted phone resting on my mahogany desk pulsed with a single sharp vibration. A secure direct message from Boone, the elite private investigator I had dispatched on an emergency basis to Nashville. I picked up the device and opened the encrypted application. Boone hadn't sent a text. He sent a single high-resolution photograph. The timestamp in the lower right corner showed the image had been captured less than 3 minutes ago. I stared at the photograph, my breathing slowed to a dead halt. Colton was not at a networking seminar. The image showed him inside the private dining room of an astronomically expensive luxury steakhouse in downtown Nashville, leaning forward, smiling broadly deep in conversation. Seated directly across from my son, returning the exact same predatory smile, was the founding chief executive officer of my largest, most dangerous corporate rival. My own son was deploying my stolen money to engineer a devastating hostile buyout of my fiercest competitor. I set the phone down on the desk. The quiet period of patient observation was officially over. I locked the screen and brought my full attention back to the encrypted laptop at the center of my desk. Warren had been watching me from across the room, his sharp eyes reading the dangerous shift in my posture without needing to be told a single word. Not a single word left my lips. I simply rotated the screen of my phone toward him, letting him see the high-resolution photograph Boone had just transmitted. Warren stared at the image of my son seated across from the chief executive officer of Vortex Global, the single most aggressive corporate adversary I had fought for the better part of a decade. For the second time that night, the color abandoned Warren's face entirely. Vortex Global had spent years trying to orchestrate hostile takeovers of my logistics networks, and I had personally beaten back every last one of their malicious moves. And now my own flesh and blood was sitting across that table from the enemy, sharing a celebratory dinner, bankrolled entirely by my stolen capital. I told Warren to stay completely silent while I established a secure, encrypted voice connection directly to Boone. The private investigator picked up on the very first ring, his voice low and razor-focused. I told him to drop the physical surveillance at the steakhouse entirely and throw every ounce of his considerable digital resources into tracing the precise flow of the $10 million loan Colton had fraudulently pulled from my commercial real estate portfolio. I needed to know exactly where that sum was sitting, and I needed to understand the precise mechanics of the financial weapon Colton was actively building against me. Boone didn't ask unnecessary questions or push for further explanation. He was a highly skilled operator who worked exclusively in the dark, tangled underbelly of global finance, tracing hidden assets and dismantling complex corporate shell games for high-net-worth clients. I sat in my soundproof study with Warren for 3 long, grinding hours, drinking strong green tea and listening to the steady ticking of the antique mantel clock in the corner. Just before dawn, the encrypted laptop chimed softly with an incoming data packet from Boone. He had successfully broken through the initial banking firewalls and traced the heavily obfuscated wire transfers through a labyrinthine maze of temporary holding accounts. The $10 million had ultimately come to rest in a primary operational account registered to a newly formed privately held corporation in Tennessee. The entity was named Ridgeway Logistics. My chest tightened as I read through the corporate incorporation documents Boone had managed to secure. Colton was listed as the primary founder and chief executive officer of Ridgeway Logistics. He wasn't simply stealing my money to fund a lavish life in Nashville. He was deploying the massive capital he'd fraudulently extracted from my properties to launch a direct, heavily financed competitor to everything I had built. But the depravity of his scheme ran considerably deeper than standing up a simple startup. Boone had uncovered a highly confidential pending acquisition contract buried deep in the digital files of that newly formed corporation. Colton wasn't planning to build anything from scratch. He was using the $10 million to execute a massive leveraged buyout of a critical regional subsidiary owned entirely by Vortex Global. By acquiring that specific subsidiary, Colton was effectively taking possession of a sprawling, highly profitable, ready-made logistics infrastructure planted directly in the center of my most profitable southern territories. He was coordinating in lockstep with my greatest corporate rival, using my own stolen money to systematically and ruthlessly dismantle my empire from the outside in. He intended to cannibalize my long-standing client contracts, undercut my established shipping routes, and bleed my company until nothing remained but a hollow, bankrupt shell. It was a perfectly engineered strategy of total financial annihilation, designed by a son who understood every last vulnerability in his father's business, because I had personally spent years teaching him exactly how it all worked. I sat staring at those acquisition documents as a deep, sickening wave of betrayal moved through me. My own son was a treacherous corporate predator of the most dangerous kind imaginable. But even as the full financial reality of his treason settled over me, Boone initiated a secondary, far more invasive digital protocol. He told me over the secure line that he was no longer limiting himself to public corporate filings and concealed bank accounts. He had quietly deployed a sophisticated intrusion script designed to penetrate Priya's personal digital footprint. Given that she was the primary legal holder of the Nashville mansion, Boone strongly suspected she was managing the more sensitive logistical threads of their cross-country conspiracy. I watched the glowing screen as Boone's proprietary software methodically bypassed the generic consumer-grade security, protecting Priya's private email servers. She had carelessly used the same weak, easily predicted passwords she'd always relied on, completely oblivious to the digital doors she was leaving wide open. Within minutes, Boone had secured full, unrestricted access to her entire inbox-outbox and hidden archive folders. I directed him to search for any correspondence dated within the last 48 hours, specifically targeting messages containing my name or any reference to the state of Ohio. The search algorithm ground through several tense seconds before surfacing a single, deeply alarming result. It was neither a sent message nor an incoming communication. It was a carefully composed draft email, saved in a hidden folder and waiting for final approval before being dispatched. The recipient address belonged to a prominent, well-connected county judge presiding over the family court division in Nashville, Tennessee. My exhausted hands began to tremble as I leaned closer to the bright monitor. I opened the unread draft, slowly, the harsh light throwing the absolute darkest corners of their conspiracy into sharp relief. The message contained a detailed clinical narrative carefully outlining my supposed rapid cognitive deterioration. It falsely claimed I was completely unmanageable, profoundly disoriented, and posed an immediate physical danger to myself. It referenced the fabricated medical records Colton had unlawfully obtained and leaned heavily on the edited out-of-context videos Priya had covertly recorded of my chemically induced stupor. They were methodically constructing a false, legally binding narrative of severe dementia. But the full horror of their plan didn't crystallize until my eyes drifted up to the specific subject line Priya had so carefully composed. I stared at those words. The icy realization stopped the blood in my veins cold. The subject line read, Emergency Guardianship Petition, Victor Harmon completely incapacitated. They weren't simply trying to steal my money and gut my corporate legacy. They were actively moving to have me legally declared incompetent, permanently to strip away every fundamental right I possessed, and bury me alive inside a locked psychiatric ward forever. The heavy silence in the room shattered when Warren brought his hand down hard on the mahogany desk. I had never once seen my composed attorney lose his bearing, but the raw reality of that drafted email pushed past every professional boundary he had. Warren began rapidly laying out the brutal, merciless mechanics of Tennessee interstate guardianship law. It was a terrifying legal loophole that Colton and Priya were exploiting with surgical precision. Warren laid out the exact sequence of events they had engineered. If Colton successfully filed that drafted petition with the Davidson County judge, supported by a fraudulently signed doctor's note from his paid clinic declaring me in immediate physical danger, to myself and others, it would trigger a sweeping cross-state jurisdiction protocol. The Tennessee court would issue an emergency medical extraction order. Tennessee law enforcement would legally coordinate with the Cleveland Police Department to cross state lines, breach my front door, and forcibly remove me from my own home. I would not be given a moment to speak with an attorney. I would not be given a chance to demonstrate my sanity. I would be transported immediately under armed guard to a heavily restricted, state-mandated psychiatric facility in Tennessee. The moment those steel doors sealed behind me, Colton would be handed complete, unchecked, 100% legal conservatorship over every bank account, physical property, and corporate asset. The suffocating horror of their elaborate trap washed over me cold, paralyzing total. They weren't merely trying to drain my finances or casually seize my position in the company. They were deliberately engineering my complete erasure from society. They wanted me sedated and confined in a sterile nightmare, staring blankly at a white hospital wall while they lived as absolute royalty on the proceeds of my life's work. I looked over at Warren. His jaw was clenched so hard the muscles pulsed beneath his pale skin. He reached immediately for his encrypted phone and said, "We need to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now." He argued forcefully that we had more than enough concrete digital evidence to have Colton and Priya arrested for massive wire fraud, grand larceny, and the malicious forgery of a medical power of attorney. He wanted their bank accounts frozen, the commercial real estate properties locked down, and the two of them tangled up in federal court for the next decade. I raised my hand slowly, palm facing out, and cut off his frantic momentum on the spot. The federal authorities were the last thing I wanted involved. I had no interest in a long, loudly publicized legal battle where Colton could hire a platoon of expensive defense attorneys, play the wounded and misunderstood son, and drag my family name through the sensationalized public mud. Calling in law enforcement over a fraud charge felt like a profound insult to the sheer magnitude of what he had done. Simple fraud was a manageable corporate inconvenience. What my son had executed was a deeply calculated act of total, unforgivable warfare. I didn't want him merely arrested. I wanted catastrophic, absolute annihilation. I wanted to tear his entire existence apart on the exact same ruthless battlefield he had so arrogantly chosen, and I wanted him to watch his stolen empire crumble to worthless ash in his own trembling hands, long before he ever glimpsed the inside of a prison cell. I turned my full attention back to the secure voice connection with Boone, who was still actively working Priya's digital footprint from the shadows. I gave him strict instructions to halt every defensive maneuver immediately. We were done playing defense. I ordered Boone to contact my private aviation crew and have my Gulfstream jet prepped for an immediate, completely unlogged departure. We were flying straight into the exposed heart of their criminal operation. We were going to Nashville, Tennessee. I told Boone firmly to have a specialized tactical team assembled and ready on the ground before my plane ever touched the tarmac. I needed his finest forensic accountants, shadow lawyers, who operated well outside conventional ethical boundaries, and a hardened physical security detail. I was going to systematically dismantle Ridgeway Logistics, rip the $10 million right out of their treacherous grasp and sever their corporate ties to my biggest rival before Colton even realized that he was under attack. I intended to move like a ghost through his newly acquired mansion and his stolen corporate infrastructure, methodically pulling down every pillar holding up his fraudulent life. Warren stared at me, eyes wide, with a blend of shock and deep, unmistakable professional respect. He lowered his phone slowly, the realization settling that the man sitting across from him was no longer simply a troubled father managing a wayward son. I was a seasoned corporate titan, readying himself for war, and I was going to execute my treacherous son with the same cold, calculated brutality he had been foolish enough to aim at me. I directed Warren to begin drafting the emergency legal countermeasures we would need to strike at the massive commercial loan, building a completely silent financial ambush that would freeze the $10 million the instant Colton moved to formally close his leveraged buyout of the rival subsidiary. We were going to cut his financial throat right there at the closing table. As Warren bent over his encrypted laptop, hammering out the intricate legal traps we planned to spring in Tennessee, the secure phone on my desk vibrated with a sharp, urgent pulse. Another direct transmission from Boone. His voice through the encrypted speaker carried a tension I had never once heard from him, stripped entirely of its usual, measured professional calm. While monitoring the concealed digital back channels of the Davidson County Judicial Network, a sudden and deeply alarming update had flashed across the restricted internal dockets. Boone had successfully intercepted a classified, tightly sealed court filing originating directly from the specific family court judge Priya had previously emailed. The judge had officially received their fabricated emergency guardianship petition built on the fraudulent doctor's note, the heavily manipulated footage of my chemically induced stupor and Colton's invented legal testimony about my supposed mental collapse. The Tennessee court had moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed. The judge had approved the preliminary medical evaluation. The reality of their accelerated timeline hit me with the force of a freight train leaving the rails. Boone read the final encrypted lines of the intercepted judicial order, his voice dropping to a grim, flat whisper. The binding warrant for my immediate and involuntary medical extraction had already been signed and stamped by the state magistrate. State troopers were scheduled to raid my Cleveland home in exactly 48 hours. I didn't waste a single second surrendering to the fear my son had so carefully engineered. The clock in my study sounded like a hammer striking iron. I looked at Warren and told him to file every available legal injunction to stall the Cleveland police, explicitly directing him to deploy my genuine medical records as an impenetrable wall around my physical estate. I grabbed my coat, walked out the front door, and got into the town car Boone had already dispatched to my driveway. The drive to the airfield passed in a silent blur of streetlights and cold arithmetic. When I stepped onto the tarmac, the engines of my Gulfstream jet were already screaming with power. Boone stood at the base of the boarding stairs holding a tactical briefcase, his face an unreadable mask of pure professional focus. We boarded and the door sealed shut behind us. As the jet cut through the night sky toward Tennessee, I sat in the cabin and worked through the digital dossier Boone had compiled on the flight. We were completely off the grid, running under an obscured tail number that Colton could never trace back to my primary holding company. My son believed I was slumped helplessly in my study, sedated, and waiting for authorities to kick down my door. He had absolutely no idea I was closing on his new sanctuary at 500 Mephiches, carrying the financial ammunition to flatten everything he had built. We touched down at a discreet private executive terminal on the outskirts of Nashville just before dawn. The humid Tennessee air met my face at the bottom of the steps, bringing with it the unsparing weight of the battlefield I had just landed on. A heavily tinted armored SUV was already idling on the runway apron, arranged by Boone's security contacts, without a trace of friction. We slid into the back seat and eased onto the highway as the morning sun began bleeding across the horizon. Boone pulled up the GPS coordinates for the multi-million-dollar mansion Priya had acquired through her corporate shell, tucked inside an exclusive, heavily gated neighborhood just 15 miles out. "We are not going to the house," I said, my voice quiet and final against the hum of the tires. "Colton and Priya are simply the vicious symptoms of this legal infection. We need to destroy the actual source, the one giving their fabricated story its oxygen. I told the driver to bypass their neighborhood entirely and head straight for the prestigious medical district at the center of the city. We were going directly to the sprawling high-end private clinic operated by Dr. Culver, the well-regarded expensive Tennessee physician who had formally signed my fraudulent dementia diagnosis and submitted the emergency guardianship petition to the local magistrate. I had initially assumed Colton had simply paid a corrupt doctor a standard cash transaction to falsify a handful of medical forms, but the sheer speed and legal force behind that court filing pointed to something far deeper and more corrosive. This physician was placing his entire medical license and his lucrative career on the line to have me legally buried. I needed to understand exactly why he was willing to cross such a treacherous line for a man he had known for only 3 short months. The driver pulled the vehicle smoothly into the pristine, manicured parking lot of the medical complex. It was an imposing structure, all reflective blue glass and polished white steel, radiating an aura of absolute wealth and exclusive medical privilege. We parked in a secluded corner space tucked deep in the shade of a row of tall oaks, completely out of sight of the main entrance. Boone didn't reach for the door handle. He opened the tactical briefcase on the seat beside him and produced a specialized military-grade digital decryption laptop. He extended a compact high-gain directional antenna and aimed it squarely at the second-floor windows of the building. I watched in complete silence as Boone launched a sophisticated network cloning protocol with practiced efficiency. He was spoofing the clinic's primary wireless access point, creating an invisible digital twin right inside our parked vehicle. Within 4 minutes, a careless administrative assistant somewhere inside that glass building connected her mobile device to Boone's counterfeit network. That single innocent mistake handed him unrestricted access to the clinic's entire internal server architecture. He punched through the secondary patient privacy firewalls and drove deep into the encrypted administrative directories. Intricate strings of code rolled down the dark monitor as Boone worked the primary database hunting for my name and date of birth. The sensitive file surfaced almost at once. He yanked the entire folder down from Dr. Culver's secure servers and drove it straight onto his encrypted hard drive. When those digital files cracked open, the full nauseating architecture of the medical conspiracy spread itself out in front of me. Every assessment was exhaustively constructed, and not one word of it was real. Dr. Culver had invented 3 in-person consultations with me out of nothing, and filled them with clinical notes, chronicling my supposed violent outbursts, my inability to hold a memory, and my total incapacity for ordinary daily life. He had even manufactured blood panel results, carefully calibrated to match the precise neurosuppressants Priya had been grinding into my meals. A seamless, legally unassailable medical execution. But locating the fraudulent assessments wasn't enough to satisfy Boone. He pivoted, pushing his digital reach into the doctor's own personal finances. A man of that standing doesn't risk everything for a stranger unless something enormous is pulling him under. Boone broke through the clinic network's shielded correspondence files and cross-referenced the private banking applications Dr. Culver had been running on that same connection. What came apart next was swift and devastating. Dr. Culver was no prosperous professional. He was a man going down fast. His banking trail exposed a ruinous fixation on high-stakes international sports. Betting unregulated, illegal, and catastrophically expensive. The respected physician was drowning beneath an avalanche of gambling debt. His practice was mortgaged to the hilt. Every personal asset had been stripped bare. He was hemorrhaging money to the kind of people who collect debts with their hands, not their lawyers. Boone pried open a buried offshore transaction ledger, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the glowing figures. He angled the laptop my direction and pressed a finger to a heavily secured wire transfer that had cleared exactly 7 days prior. Priya hadn't simply handed the doctor a fee for his trouble. Drawing directly from the massive commercial loan they had stolen out of my real estate holdings, she had sent exactly $150,000 into an untraceable account controlled by the doctor's own bookie. I burned those routing numbers into my memory, the chain connecting my looted commercial equity to a physician's illegal gambling debt stretched out before me in cold digital light. That was our smoking gun. Boone broke down the mobile cloning rig. Time to sever the head from this particular snake. He neutralized the electronic gate at the back of the clinic, and we were through. The entire glass building sat in darkness except for a single window glowing on the second floor. Dr. Culver hadn't gone home. We entered through the staff door without a sound. Boone's bypass token killed the internal alarm system in seconds, and we drifted through the antiseptic corridors. Like we weren't there at all. The air tasted sterile and cold. Outside the heavy mahogany door of the executive medical suite, I didn't pause. I gripped the brass handle, turned it, and entered without a word of warning. Dr. Culver sat hunched behind his oversized desk, with his face pressed into his shaking hands. A glass of amber liquor perched on a pile of scattered documents. The door swinging open snapped his head up hard. Terror, naked and unfiltered, flashed through his eyes in the first instant. Then his focus landed on my face, and whatever color was left in him simply evacuated. I didn't raise my voice. I kept the furnace inside my chest, sealed shut. I covered the distance to his desk in long, deliberate strides, and stood over him. I reached into my coat, drew out a thick manila folder, and dropped it flat onto the center of the desk. The thud it made was final. I told him to open it. His fingers were trembling so badly he nearly fumbled the cover. He got it open. The first pages staring up at him were sharp printouts of the offshore wire transfers Priya had pushed through exactly 7 days earlier. Below those sat clean copies of every fabricated cognitive assessment he had filed with the Davidson County Court. The full scope of his medical fraud was lying exposed under the harsh halogen light. A single bead of sweat crawled down the side of his pale face. "You are a man of science, doctor," I said, voice flat and utterly cold, each word precise as a scalpel. "So let us examine what the evidence on your desk actually tells us. You colluded in a massive scheme of interstate wire fraud. You put your signature on falsified legal medical records. You took $150,000 in money stolen directly from my commercial holdings. You turned the Tennessee judicial system into a weapon against a man in full possession of his faculties. And every last bit of it was done to clear an illegal gambling debt." I let that land. Let each federal charge press its full weight into his shoulders. "The sentencing guidelines for what you have done will ensure you never leave a federal prison under your own power." His mouth moved but produced nothing. His throat had seized. A wretched choked sound came out instead of words. His eyes crawled from the documents to my face, searching desperately for a clemency he had forfeited the moment he signed that first false page. I set both palms on the front edge of his desk and leaned in, filling his field of vision completely. "I haven't come here to haggle," I said. "I'm giving you one exit from total ruin. One." Boone materialized from the doorway and laid a blank sworn affidavit and a heavy silver fountain pen squarely on top of the forged records. "You will write a full and detailed confession covering everything I said, and you will formally retract the emergency guardianship petition you filed." The blank page seemed to terrify him more than I did. "If I put my name on that," he stammered, voice fractured and barely holding together, "I'm confessing to malpractice. My career ends. I lose everything I have." I looked at him the way you look at something broken beyond repair. "That career ended the moment you cashed the first payment. You sold your medical oath for dirty money. That transaction is done and cannot be undone. This isn't a choice between your reputation and your livelihood anymore. It's a choice between walking away quietly and spending whatever years you have left inside a federal cell. Refuse to sign, and I hand this folder to the FBI before the sun clears the horizon. You will be in handcuffs by morning. Take the pen." A long broken sob escaped Dr. Culver. He lifted the silver pen with a hand that shook so violently the letters barely held their shape. For the next 20 minutes, the only noise in that room was ink working frantically across heavy paper. He laid out the full conspiracy without omission, Priya's opening calls. Colton's hard-edged demands, the exact figures they had dangled in exchange for arranging my permanent confinement. When the last line was written, he scrawled his legal name at the bottom and shoved the pages back across the desk. Boone secured the document on the spot, stamping the signature with a specialized field notary seal and locking the confession away. The legal instrument to halt the police raid was now in our hands. I turned my back on the collapsed man without another glance. His cowardice was beneath contempt. I had what I came for. Boone and I were already crossing toward the door, the next phase of our assault, forming in my mind, when Dr. Culver's voice came tearing out of the dark behind us, ragged and urgent. "Victor, wait," he said, almost pleading. "There's something else. Something about their schedule you don't know yet." I turned slowly. My eyes found him. "They're not sitting back waiting for the troopers to deliver you," he rushed out. "The acquisition is moving right now. They're sealing the $10 million hostile buyout tomorrow night. They're hosting a gala at the mansion to market." I studied the shattered man in front of me as something cold and brilliant sharpened inside my head. Colton wasn't dismantling my life quietly in shadows. He was throwing a celebration, a grand public spectacle of my defeat, staged directly in front of the rivals I had battled for decades. He was certain I was sedated, broken, and hours away from disappearing behind locked ward doors forever. He believed himself completely beyond reach. I said nothing to the doctor. I walked out into the cool Tennessee night. What I uncovered in the hours that followed was something no father should ever have to face: a depth of calculation that changes the way you see everything and everyone. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you suspected that someone you loved was quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait, gather every piece of proof, and let them believe they had already won? The battlefield was perfectly set. The trap was fully armed. Tomorrow night, my treacherous son was going to learn exactly what happens when you confidently invite a ghost to your own victory celebration. I walked back to the armored vehicle where Boone was stowing his equipment. We pulled away from the clinic in complete silence, the neon lights of Nashville smearing past the tinted glass. My mind had already narrowed to a single point: the precise mechanical steps of his coming destruction. We arrived at a secure executive suite Boone had reserved under a clean alias to guarantee our anonymity. Warren Falk was already there, wearing a groove into the hardwood floor with his phone pinned to his ear. The moment he saw me come through the door, he killed the call and pointed toward the dining table, which was blanketed in printed financial schematics. "Victor, we have a critical vulnerability," he said, his voice carrying the tight edge of professional alarm. "I've traced the routing structure of the $10 million loan. Colton pledged your most profitable Cleveland Tower holdings as collateral. He used the forged medical power of attorney to push the capital into the operating accounts of Ridgeway Logistics. Tomorrow night at this gala, he's set to formally execute the final acquisition paperwork with Vortex Global. Once that signature goes down and the wire transfer initiates, clawing that capital back will mean months of grinding federal litigation." I poured a glass of cold water, took a measured sip, and set it down without a word. "You're looking at the surface layer of my portfolio, Warren," I said, keeping my voice smooth and unhurried. "You're examining the corporate architecture I deliberately left, exposed the visible weakness I built for anyone who came hunting. But you don't assemble a billion-dollar logistics empire without engineering a failsafe that nobody can see." Warren's brow furrowed, his legal mind working rapidly through the implication. "What are you telling me, Victor?" "The commercial property deeds are public record. The loans are actively registered." I let my voice drop, slow, deliberate, low. 3 years ago, when I formally stepped back from day-to-day operations and handed Colton a more prominent leadership role, I did not leave my core liquid wealth sitting exposed in standard domestic accounts. Granting that level of unchecked authority to an ambitious executive demanded an equally invisible and equally massive safety net. I converted a substantial portion of my secondary holdings and moved every core asset into a financial fortress that no domestic legal instrument can penetrate. I established a specialized Swiss blind trust. Warren's eyes shifted, a subtle widening that told me he hadn't known. He was well versed in high-level wealth management, but this particular layer of my finances had been built for him never to find. That trust, I went on, moving steadily across the thick carpet, was architected from the ground up to be legally impenetrable. Its servers sit offline, buried inside a decommissioned military installation deep in the Swiss Alps. But the real force behind it is what I embedded in its defensive code. I had the international trustees wear a lethal automated mechanism directly into the foundational architecture. I call it the poison pill clause. Boone looked up from his tactical laptop, his attention visibly sharpening as the shape of what I was describing came into focus. "Colton believes that holding my forged signature and a fraudulent medical power of attorney hands him total dominion over my financial life. I let that picture sit for a moment, my son's arrogant certainty. He assumed that waving a notarized document in front of a domestic bank would swing open every vault, and for the initial $10 million margin loan, that assumption held domestic institutions are reliably complacent when presented with forms that look legitimate. But that $10 million is currently sitting in a monitored escrow account and going nowhere on its own. To release those funds and push the final transfer to Vortex Global, the primary account holder must supply overriding authorization. I stopped moving and held Warren's gaze directly. The poison pill clause requires that any major capital withdrawal exceeding exactly $1 million cannot be cleared by a signature, a digital passcode, or any written legal document whatsoever. It demands a live physical biometric scan, a live retinal verification heavily encrypted and processed in real time, paired with a dynamic vocal passphrase that exists only inside my body. Warren's mouth opened slightly as the full architecture of the trap assembled itself in his mind. Colton has no idea, he said quietly, his eyes drifting to the financial schematics on the table. Not the slightest, I confirmed my voice, flat as stone. He's certain his forged paperwork overrides everything I've built. He genuinely believes he ghosted past my security because I let him walk through a decoy perimeter without resistance. Tomorrow night he is going to stand in front of his wealthy new associates, his corrupt medical co-conspirators, and the chief executive of our largest corporate rival. He is going to sign a binding commercial acquisition contract publicly committing to a $10 million subsidiary purchase. I pressed both hands flat against the cool, polished surface of the dining table and leaned forward. And when he moves to initiate the mandatory wire transfer to close that deal, the Swiss servers will demand a live biometric authentication. Colton will fail. The transfer will be rejected outright. But the system doesn't simply decline and go quiet. The poison pill protocol detonates, triggering a catastrophic, fully irrevocable digital alarm that cannot be walked back. It flags the unauthorized attempt as a deliberate act of federal wire fraud and international money laundering. Simultaneously, it fires off an encrypted data packet complete with all fraudulent transaction logs, the forged power of attorney, and the originating IP addresses directly to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of the Treasury, and Interpol. Warren swallowed. His professional instincts were clearly warring with the sheer ruthlessness of what I'd constructed. He glanced at the clock on the wall, then back to me. Victor, if we let this play out, the legal fallout will be enormous. We already hold hard proof of the forged medical documents. We have the offshore wire transfers on record. The bribery is documented. We can freeze the commercial escrow right now and lock down the $10 million before the gala even starts. We can protect your capital without tripping the international wire fraud mechanism. I studied my longtime attorney from across the room. He was brilliant, but he was still reasoning like a cautious, risk-averse lawyer who had never fought a war this personal. No, I said quietly, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. Let them execute the buyout contract first. Let them put the felony in writing and commit to it fully. The following evening settled over the Tennessee hills with a dense, suffocating humidity. We sat in darkness, motionless, inside a heavily modified, blacked-out surveillance van parked directly across from the sprawling grounds of Crestline Holdings. The estate Priya had so casually described as a rental was a breathtaking architectural statement of pure arrogance, multi-million dollars of glass iron and manicured excess. Enormous wrought iron gates framed sweeping lawns, a broad circular driveway, and floor-to-ceiling windows that poured warm light into the gathering dark. Everything about the property was a physical monument to the legacy they had stolen from me over 30 years of work. And tonight, that stolen mansion was hosting a party in honor of my destruction. A steady river of luxury vehicles glided through the open security gates. Valets in crisp white shirts sprinted to collect sleek sports cars and heavy executive sedans. Colton and Priya had burned no time planting themselves in the wealthy upper tier of the local social landscape. They had staged a fully catered gala, spending without hesitation to project an image of absolute, untouchable corporate authority. Through the tinted surveillance window, I watched white-gloved staff move silver trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers among the elaborately dressed guests drifting across the outdoor terraces. My son was performing the role of the self-made corporate titan, a role financed entirely by a slow, calculated poisoning of his own father. Boone sat beside me in the cramped van, ringed by a wall of specialized tactical monitors, casting pale light across his face. He wasn't watching the visual feed. He was getting ready to harvest what the cameras couldn't capture the audio. Boone carefully mounted a military-grade laser microphone onto a stabilized tripod, training the invisible beam directly at the broad glass panels of the main formal dining room. The technology worked by reading microscopic vibrations on the window surface, caused by voices inside translating those imperceptible tremors into crystal-clear digital audio. He worked through a series of frequency filters, stripping out the ambient clatter of silverware, the soft jazz, drifting from outdoor speakers and the general murmur of the crowded party. Within seconds, an isolated audio feed crackled alive inside our soundproofed van. The voices of my enemies poured into the darkness with chilling, absolute clarity. I heard Priya laughing, a bright, polished sound that curdled something deep in my gut. She was holding court near the grand entryway, weaving a completely fabricated account of our family situation for a cluster of local investors. We simply needed a dramatic change of scenery. Priya purred to a diamond-draped woman across from her. Cleveland had become exhausting, and Victor, that's Colton's father, has taken a very sudden and very serious turn health-wise. We had no choice but to step in and take over management of his affairs completely. It has been a heavy burden, but Colton has shown extraordinary strength in assuming command of the corporate empire. I sat in the darkened van with my jaw locked so tight my teeth ached. She was constructing the social scaffolding for my disappearance, carefully building the public story of the tragic declining father and the courageous son who had risen nobly to shoulder the family legacy. A masterful performance, a nauseating one. But the true centerpiece of the evening wasn't the local social set. Boone tapped my arm and directed my attention to a secondary monitor. A long, polished black limousine had eased up to the front entrance. A tall man with silver hair and an impeccably fitted suit stepped out, flanked by two stone-faced corporate lawyers hauling heavy leather briefcases. Randall Thorne, founding chief executive of Vortex Global, the relentless predatory rival I had personally turned back at every advance for years. And now he was walking through the front door of my stolen home, personally invited by my own son. Colton practically threw himself out of the front door to meet him, pumping his hand with a frantic eagerness that bordered on embarrassing subservience. My son was desperately performing dominance while operating completely out of his depth, swimming in shark-infested water on a stolen life raft, genuinely believing himself to be the apex predator. We listened closely as Colton steered Randall Thorne away from the noise of the party and into the quiet seclusion of the formal dining room. The heavy wooden doors closed firmly behind them, isolating the key players for the final fatal transaction. Boone locked the laser microphone onto that pane of glass and brought their muted businesslike exchange into perfect resolution. "Thank you for making the trip on such short notice." "Randall," Colton said, his voice carrying a strained, manufactured confidence, "I wanted to mark this transition in surroundings worthy of what we're building together." Randall Thorne responded with a low, measured chuckle. "I'll be candid with you, Colton. When you first approached me about a leveraged buyout of my southern subsidiary, I had serious reservations. Your father has shut down every expansion attempt I've made into his primary territories for over a decade. I assumed you were carrying out his orders." "My father is no longer at the helm," Colton replied, his tone carrying a cold, absolute finality. "He has suffered a complete and irreversible cognitive breakdown. He is no longer capable of managing complex operations. I hold his full legal power of attorney, and I am liquidating his commercial portfolio to capitalize this venture. Ridgeway Logistics is the future. We are cutting loose the dead weight." I sat in the darkness of the surveillance van and listened to my only son describe my total erasure in the language of routine business. Restructuring, selling my life's work to my greatest enemy at a fraction of its value, purely to feed an ego that had never earned a single brick of what it was now claiming. "I see," Randall Thorne murmured, The sound of heavy bound folders landing on the dining table carried cleanly through the audio feed. I've reviewed the financial disclosures and the letters of credit from your lending institution thoroughly. The $10 million equity is verified and sitting in escrow. Once the capital clears my accounts by tomorrow morning, the subsidiary, its physical assets, and full regional infrastructure transfers to you entirely. Boone's fingers hovered above his primary keyboard. He looked across at me, eyes steady, waiting for the word. One command and we could freeze the escrow. Right now, halt the wire transfer. Before ink ever touched paper, collapse the hostile buyout in a single keystroke. I shook my head slowly. My gaze held the glowing windows of the mansion. Stopping them wasn't enough. I needed them to walk voluntarily into the federal machinery, with full criminal intent documented in writing. I wanted the irrefutable proof of what they had done, not just what they'd planned. A crisp, clean sound cuts through the digital feed, the bright pop of an expensive champagne cork, followed by the delicate ring of crystal flutes meeting. "To a remarkably profitable partnership," Randall Thorne said smoothly, "and to the future of Ridgeway Logistics." "To the future," Colton answered, his voice trembling at the edges with barely contained triumph. I heard the rustle of heavy parchment. Then came the unmistakable scratch of a fountain pen moving across signature lines, deliberate. The scratching stopped. The folders snapped shut. "Excellent," Randall Thorne said, his tone hardening into the clipped register of pure business. "The contracts are executed. I'll need the final authorization from your lending institution to release the $10 million from escrow." Colton drew his laptop closer. The sound of his keystrokes reached us clearly in the van, the sound of a man confidently stepping off a ledge he could not see. "Consider it done, Randall," Colton announced, his voice carrying the full catastrophic weight of his delusion. "I'm authorizing the final release protocol now. The funds are transferring as we speak." I let the breathtaking arrogance of that statement settle in the air around me. He genuinely believed his stolen authority was without limit. I turned away from the surveillance monitors and opened the matte black casing of my encrypted tactical laptop. The screen threw cold pale light across the interior of the van. Boone sat motionless beside me, his eyes fixed on the dining room feed. I accessed the restricted offline communication terminal, linked directly to the subterranean servers in the Swiss Alps. My fingers paused above the keys for less than a breath before I began typing. I opened a new secured message directed to the primary trustee of my sovereign accounts and entered the subject line we had established 3 years earlier for exactly this contingency: irrevocable trust, revocation, fraud, protocol alpha. No greeting, no signature. I attached the raw digital capture of the unauthorized wire transfer attempt alongside the fabricated medical power of attorney and pressed send. The transmission bounced off the encrypted satellite relay and buried itself in the European servers in under 4 seconds. What followed was entirely automated, merciless, precise, and completely beyond any human intervention. The poison pill protocol came online with terrifying efficiency. Deep inside the global financial network, the $10 million wire transfer Colton had so confidently launched struck an impenetrable digital barrier. The escrow gateway did not simply decline the transaction for failed authentication. It seized the funds outright, locking the entire balance under a sovereign legal freeze that no domestic instrument could reverse. But the system's architecture was designed to reach far beyond asset protection. The instant the unauthorized transfer was rejected, the Swiss servers launched their secondary countermeasures without pause. A massive encrypted data packet containing the forged documents, the unauthorized routing requests, and the specific IP addresses originating from inside the stolen mansion was automatically compiled and dispatched. The algorithms simultaneously notified the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the enforcement arm of the Securities and Exchange Commission. My son had just permanently branded himself and Ridgeway Logistics as active perpetrators of coordinated money laundering and interstate wire fraud on the Federal Register. I had the visual feed of the formal dining room locked on my screen, waiting for the digital devastation to physically register at the table. Randall Thorne was reclined in his leather chair, a smug, deeply satisfied smile carved into his weathered face. He lazily swirled the expensive champagne in his crystal flute, completely primed to toast his final triumph over his oldest rival. Colton sat directly across from him, practically radiating with stolen, unearned power. A heavy silence blanketed the room for 30 agonizing seconds as the sophisticated banking application on the laptop strained to process the enormous financial request. I could pinpoint the exact moment the fatal error code bloomed across his glowing screen. Colton frowned sharply, a subtle, bewildered crease appearing between his dark eyebrows. He lurched forward, squinting hard at the bright monitor, as though his own eyes had turned against him. His fingers flew across the keyboard, trying to manually refresh the secure banking portal. The system fired back instantly with a flashing red security notification. The account wasn't merely frozen, it was locked down entirely and flagged for serious federal review. Randall Thorne caught the sudden shift in Colton's posture. The seasoned corporate predator leaned in his smug expression, draining into one of cold, calculating suspicion. "Is there an issue with the final clearance?" "Colton," he asked, every trace of warmth stripped from his voice. Colton swallowed hard, his throat visibly working on the high-definition feed. "No, Randall, absolutely none." He stammered, a thin film of cold sweat rising across his forehead. "It's only a minor routing delay, a standard security precaution for a transfer of this magnitude. I'll have my personal bankers authorize a manual override first thing tomorrow morning." Randall Thorne fixed him with flat, merciless eyes. "Tomorrow morning was not the agreement, Colton." He stated it coldly. "You gave me your explicit assurance the capital was fully cleared and ready for immediate deployment. I don't sign binding corporate acquisition contracts on the strength of a morning delay." Colton began hammering his keyboard, in a frenzy, desperately trying to reach the secondary operational accounts he'd set up, using the heavily fraudulent medical power of attorney. He was grasping blindly for any financial lifeline that might salvage the collapsing deal. But the poison pill protocol had not simply locked the $10 million escrow account. It had aggressively cut every financial thread tied to those forged legal documents. The entire stolen empire was shutting down systematically in real time, leaving him effectively bankrupt. While Colton frantically tried to placate his furious rival inside that sealed dining room, an entirely separate, deeply domestic crisis was erupting in the grand foyer among all their wealthy guests. Boone shifted the primary laser microphone toward the front of the house, pulling in the chaotic audio of the massive gala. Priya was still positioned near the sweeping staircase, completely unaware of the catastrophic financial collapse unfolding quietly down the dark hallway. She was laughing loudly, gripping a half-empty glass of expensive wine, reveling in her stolen identity as an elite Tennessee socialite. I watched a man in a crisp black tuxedo approach her, the senior operational manager of the high-end catering company they'd engaged for the lavish event. His face was ashen, his posture rigid, with acute professional discomfort, perspiration visible on his brow. The catering manager cleared his dry throat nervously, leaning in close to speak over the music and the bustling crowd. He had no desire to cause a public scene, but his dilemma simply could not wait. Priya turned toward him, her manufactured smile faltering slightly as she read the tension in his face. She exhaled a sharp, irritated sigh, plainly annoyed at this interruption of her triumphant performance. "Is there a problem with the service tonight?" she demanded, her voice carrying a distinct edge of arrogant condescension. The manager shifted his weight, stealing a glance at the wealthy guests standing nearby. He dropped his voice to a strained whisper, but our sensitive tactical microphone captured every devastating word. "Mrs. Reed, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience," he murmured. "We attempted to run the final pre-authorized charge for the $50,000 catering invoice." The bank hadn't merely declined the transaction. The merchant services terminal had explicitly directed us to physically confiscate the card and contact the Federal Fraud Department at once. Her exclusive Black American Express card had been violently and permanently flagged by the issuing bank. Priya stared at the catering manager in total uncomprehending silence. The heavy crystal wine glass in her hand trembled, the expensive red liquid sloshing against the delicate rim. She drew breath to aggressively dress the man down, to loudly insist he run the premium card again and stop humiliating her in front of her new affluent social circle. But before a single word of her vicious entitlement could leave her lips, an entirely different sound tore the elegant atmosphere of the evening to pieces. It began as a distant, high-pitched wail, rolling over the dark Tennessee hills, multiplying and building until it became a deafening, terrifying chorus. The low, rhythmic pulse of the jazz band was instantly swallowed by the synchronized screaming of heavy law enforcement sirens. Inside the dark surveillance van, I leaned toward the glowing tactical monitors, my breathing steady and controlled. The show was finally beginning. Through the sensitive audio feed, I heard the collective gasp of the wealthy guests on the terrace, as flashing red and blue lights swept across the manicured trees and the sprawling front lawn in frantic strobing color. The massive custom wrought iron gates that Colton had proudly installed to hold the real world at arm's length did not glide open to grant entry. A heavy reinforced tactical vehicle struck the center locking mechanism at 40 miles per hour. The deafening crash of buckling metal rang through the humid night air. Four massive blacked-out SUVs, trailed by a fleet of marked Tennessee State Trooper cruisers, aggressively swept into the circular driveway, the pristine gravel shredded beneath heavy tires as the federal convoy rapidly locked down a dominant perimeter around the stolen mansion. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents in tactical vests, blazoned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, poured from the dark vehicles. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, no shouting, no weapons drawn, yet their sheer physical presence commanded the entire estate. The affluent party guests froze in collective terror. Wealthy investors and elite socialites sloshed expensive champagne onto the imported stone walkways, scrambling to clear the path of the advancing federal strike team. Priya let the wine glass slip from her hand entirely. It shattered against the marble floor of the grand foyer, but the sharp crack was swallowed whole by the overwhelming chaos of the raid. Boone toggled expertly through the camera feeds, tracking the lead federal agent as he marched straight through the massive glass front doors, flanked by a tight squad of grim state troopers. At that precise moment, the heavy wooden doors of the formal dining room swung open wide. Colton and Randall Thorne stepped out into the main hallway, completely blind to the catastrophic reality unfolding mere feet away. Colton was still clutching his leather portfolio, his face flushed with the temporary arrogant high of his wholly fraudulent corporate victory. He was mid-sentence with Randall, likely floating some smooth excuse for the inexplicable financial delay, when he finally looked up and registered the overwhelming presence of federal law enforcement occupying his grand foyer. The smug, arrogant smile on my son's face did not collapse immediately. Instead, it slowly transformed into a mask of supreme, deeply insulated corporate privilege. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. He assumed this was some minor misunderstanding, perhaps a routine noise complaint from a jealous neighbor or a simple clerical error over the catering permits. He calmly straightened the lapels of his expensive custom-tailored suit and walked directly toward the lead federal agent, projecting the same polished, rehearsed charm he had used to deceive me for months. "Officer, there must be some kind of massive misunderstanding here," Colton announced loudly, his voice ringing with arrogant authority. "I am the Chief Executive Officer of Ridgeway Logistics. We are hosting a highly private, elite corporate event. I demand to know exactly who authorized this aggressive intrusion onto my personal property." The lead agent did not break his deliberate stride. He stopped 2 feet from my son, his posture radiating absolute unyielding authority. Colton reached into his tailored jacket pocket and produced the folded, notarized copy of the medical power of attorney he carried everywhere like a shield. He shoved the fraudulent document toward the federal agent's chest. "I have the absolute legal authority to conduct business here," Colton insisted, his voice climbing in desperate, fabricated indignation. "I am the sole legal conservator for my father's entire estate. Whatever banking error flagged your system is entirely without merit. Examine the legal signatures for yourself. You have no jurisdiction whatsoever disrupt this private commercial transaction." The federal agent didn't so much as glance at the heavy parchment trembling in my son's outstretched hand. He looked directly into Colton's widening eyes with an expression of cold professional contempt. "Colton Reed." The agent announced, his voice a deep, booming baritone that instantly silenced every corner of the sprawling mansion. You are hereby under formal federal arrest for the commission of large-scale interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, criminal corporate espionage, and the deliberate malicious forgery of binding legal medical documents. The agent reached smoothly to his tactical belt and unclipped a pair of heavy polished steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clink obliterated the last lingering shreds of Colton's corporate illusion. Randall Thorne, the ruthless corporate predator who had been standing directly behind my son, immediately grasped the catastrophic legal exposure. He physically stepped away, severing all proximity to Colton, his face contorting into a mask of furious, calculated self-preservation. He understood in an instant that he had been expertly maneuvered into participating in a massive federal crime. Colton finally broke. The polished, rehearsed corporate facade crumbled, entirely exposing the terrified, deeply cowardly boy concealed beneath the expensive suit. He scanned the crowded room in a frenzy, desperately searching for any validation from the wealthy strangers, witnessing his complete humiliation. He threw his hands up, screaming at the top of his lungs, "This is an absolute mistake. My father is severely demented. Call the authorities in Cleveland right now. He is completely incapacitated. He has no idea what he's doing. I am the only one working to preserve his legacy. The man is entirely out of his mind." His voice cracked with raw, miserable desperation as the federal agents seized his arms. He kept screaming his vicious, fabricated narrative, clinging desperately to the false medical diagnosis he had bought and paid for. He genuinely believed that sustaining the elaborate lie could somehow halt the devastating federal raid. I sat in the dark surveillance van, listening to his desperate, pathetic falsehoods pour through the digital audio feed. I slowly reached forward and powered down the glowing tactical monitors. I turned to Boone and gave him a single definitive nod. Then I reached for the heavy metal handle of the van door. The large sliding doors of the blacked-out surveillance van parked directly across the street swung open. The heavy, humid night air enveloped me immediately, but I felt nothing except the pure, unadulterated ice moving through my veins. Boone flanked me in silence, posture rigid and alert, carrying the physical record of my son's complete destruction in a slim tactical briefcase. I paused for a fraction of a second at the edge of the street, letting the blinding red and blue lights of the federal cruisers wash over me. I was not dressed in the loose, comfortable clothing of a frail, failing old man. I was wearing a meticulously tailored midnight blue bespoke suit I reserved exclusively for corporate warfare. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, my mind sharper than it had been in 3 decades. I drew a long, measured breath, feeling the tremendous weight of absolute clarity settle into my bones, and I began my steady march up the long, sweeping, circular driveway of the stolen mansion. The chaotic scene on the manicured front lawn began to shift the moment my presence registered within the perimeter. The armed federal agents who had been managing the bewildered crowd of wealthy socialites instinctively drew aside to let me pass. They recognized the unmistakable presence of absolute authority. The firm crunch of my leather soles against the pristine white gravel seemed to ring louder than the distant wailing sirens. The affluent guests, the local investors, and the elite social circle Colton had worked so desperately to impress all turned to stare. They had spent the last 2 hours listening to Priya spin a tragic, wholly fabricated story about my severe cognitive decline. They had been told I was completely incapacitated, a broken shell of a man locked away in a room in Cleveland. Now they were looking directly at a formidable corporate titan radiating lethal, unapologetic power. A collective, audible gasp moved through the beautifully dressed crowd. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead, indifferent to the stunned whispers and frantic murmurs rippling around me. As I neared the massive marble steps leading to the grand foyer, I finally spotted Priya. She stood frozen beside one of the towering stone pillars. Her flawless, carefully constructed exterior had disintegrated entirely. Her expensive designer gown hung awkwardly on her trembling frame. She was staring at me with wide, completely terrified eyes, the shattered remains of a crystal champagne flute resting in a glittering puddle at her feet. She had just understood that her declined premium credit card was no simple banking error. It was the opening move of a fully orchestrated financial apocalypse. I did not offer her so much as a glance of recognition. I walked past her without breaking stride, ascending the marble steps, and crossing the threshold into the blazing light of the foyer. The vast interior of the mansion was a chaotic tableau of federal law enforcement and corporate panic. Randall Thorne, the aggressive chief executive officer of Vortex Global, was loudly berating his two panicked corporate lawyers, demanding they immediately reach his private jet pilot. He was desperately attempting to extract himself from the federal crime scene, cutting every operational tie to the ruined logistics company he had just tried to acquire. But my focus remained entirely fixed on the young man standing at the very center of the room. Colton was frozen in the grip of two towering federal agents. The heavy steel handcuffs gleamed harshly beneath the massive crystal chandelier. The blood had drained completely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent gray. His mouth hung slightly open, his chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths, as his panicked mind struggled to process the absolute impossibility of my physical presence. I was the ghost he had confidently buried in a fabricated medical grave, and I had just walked through his front door to personally oversee his reckoning. I crossed the polished marble floor with deliberate steps. Colton's terrified eyes tracked my every movement, silently pleading for a rescue he had no right to expect. I stopped mere inches from him, yet ignored his existence entirely. I treated the trembling boy in the expensive suit as nothing more than a piece of broken, discarded furniture. I turned slightly and directed my full attention to the lead federal agent, the stern man who had just placed my son under formal arrest. The seasoned agent squared his shoulders, one hand resting near his tactical belt, as he assessed my arrival. "Sir, this is an active federal crime scene," the agent stated, his voice carrying rigid authority. "Step back immediately and identify yourself." I met his eyes, directly projecting the calm, unyielding command I had built over a lifetime of corporate warfare. "My name is Victor Harmon," I stated clearly, making certain my voice carried across the silent, captivated room. "I'm the sole founder, the absolute owner, and the acting chief executive officer of Harmon Global Logistics. I am also the direct victim of the large-scale, highly coordinated interstate wire fraud currently being executed inside this building." The federal agent blinked, his rigid professional composure faltering for just a fraction of a second as he processed my identity. His gaze moved from my commanding posture to the trembling, pathetic figure of my son, instantly registering the enormous gap between the legal documents and reality. Before the agent could form another question, Boone stepped smoothly to my side and opened the tactical briefcase. He drew out the thick, heavy manila folder we had secured from the private medical clinic less than an hour earlier. I took it and extended it firmly toward the lead investigator. "I believe you're looking for the true architect of this particular fraud," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a finely sharpened blade. "Here he is. I strongly advise your forensic accountants to examine the contents of this dossier with great care. Inside, you will find complete detailed financial routing, records tracing exactly $10 million stolen from my commercial real estate portfolio. You will also find definitive, legally verified proof of international money laundering, specifically tracing substantial wire transfers directed to an illegal offshore gambling syndicate." The federal agent slowly reached out and took the heavy folder, his sharp eyes moving across the official seals and the comprehensive digital transaction logs visible on the opening page. I pressed on, refusing to allow the silence to settle. "Furthermore, you will find a fully notarized, sworn written confession provided voluntarily this evening by Dr. Culver. That legal document details explicitly how he was aggressively bribed by the individuals occupying this house to fabricate my medical records in their entirety. The power of attorney currently resting in your evidence bag is a complete and total forgery. I am of perfectly sound mind, and I personally initiated the federal poison pill protocol that permanently locked down their fraudulent escrow accounts." The absolute finality of those words settled like a stone into the dead silence of the grand foyer. The lead agent slowly closed the heavy folder, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, relentless federal justice. He redirected his attention to my son, and the grip of the surrounding agents visibly tightened on Colton's arms. The entire house of cards had collapsed completely, leaving nothing behind but the terrifying reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence. Colton finally broke. The last fragment of his arrogant manufactured corporate persona evaporated in an instant. He dropped violently to his knees on the cold marble floor, the heavy steel handcuffs clanking harshly against the polished stone. He looked up at me, tears running freely down his pale, terrified face. "Dad, please!" He wailed, his voice a broken, pathetic cry that rang through every corner of the massive house. "You have to make them stop. We can fix this. I'm so sorry. We can explain everything." I looked slowly down at the weeping, wretched figure groveling at my leather shoes. I felt no pity, no residual paternal warmth, and not a single trace of regret. He had chosen the battlefield himself, and he had been foolish enough to bring a knife to a nuclear war. I met his terrified, desperate eyes with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. "You forgot to tell me you moved, Colton," I said softly, making certain every devastating syllable landed. "And I forgot to tell you I designed the security system you tried to wipe." The chaotic flashing lights of the Tennessee hills faded into a distant, muted memory, hours later as the solid steel doors of the Federal Detention Center closed firmly behind me. The jarring shift from the lavish warmth of their stolen mansion to the harsh, unforgiving, fluorescent glare of the government holding facility was immediate and total. I walked the long, sterile corridor, with Warren at my side, the rhythmic echo of my leather shoes against the linoleum floor, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. The cold air carried the distinct taste of industrial bleach and unyielding institutional authority. The lead federal agent, the disciplined man who had executed the raid with flawless tactical precision, met us near a heavy reinforced security door at the far end of the hallway. He offered a brief, respectful nod and informed me I had been legally granted exactly 5 minutes of unrecorded, completely private access before formal booking and processing began. I did not need a single second more. I took the cold metal handle, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped directly into the cramped, windowless interrogation room. The claustrophobic space was engineered to strip away every last illusion of personal comfort or corporate standing. It held nothing but a deeply scarred, bolted-down aluminum table and 3 rigid metal chairs. Colton and Priya sat close together on the far side of the cold table, looking like hollow, shattered reflections of the arrogant socialites who had confidently hosted a lavish gala just hours before. The expensive, custom-tailored tuxedo Colton had worn so proudly was now violently wrinkled and deeply disheveled, the silken bow tie long since discarded. Priya sat rigidly beside him, shivering visibly in the harsh, freezing air, her extravagant designer gown looking utterly absurd and entirely pathetic in the bleak, sterile room. The heavy steel handcuffs binding their wrists clinked sharply against the metal table as they looked up simultaneously at my entrance. The pure, unadulterated terror radiating from their bloodshot eyes was physically palpable, a thick, suffocating aura of undeniable guilt and profound regret. They had spent long, deceitful months treating me like a disposable, incompetent burden, pushing me aggressively toward a heavily medicated medical oblivion. Now the crushing weight of their catastrophic failure was pressing down on them beneath the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. I did not sit. I stood tall and rigid on my side of the aluminum table, projecting the absolute freezing dominance of a man who had navigated the darkest corporate waters for over 3 decades. Colton shattered the heavy silence first, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper completely stripped of dignity or pride. "Dad, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, straining forward as far as the steel chains would allow. "This entire situation is a horrific mistake. I never wanted any of this to reach this level. It was not my idea to circumvent the standard corporate succession protocols." He gestured frantically toward the trembling woman seated beside him, his baseline survival instincts instantly overriding any lingering marital loyalty. It was Priya. She was the one who drove the accelerated acquisition timeline. She found the corrupt doctor in Nashville. She made the illegal offshore wire transfers while I was focused entirely on managing the daily operations of the logistics company. I was only trying to protect our family assets from corporate stagnation. Dad, I was trying to build something larger for all of us. She manipulated the medical paperwork to seize total leverage. I swear to you on my life, I never truly intended to lock you away in a facility permanently. Priya snapped her head toward him, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure shock and profound marital betrayal. She could not believe her husband was throwing her to the federal wolves so quickly and ruthlessly to save his own skin. She turned her desperate red-rimmed eyes immediately toward me, reaching instinctively for the ultimate emotional shield she believed would guarantee her safety. "Victor, please, you cannot let them do this to us," she sobbed, her voice shaking with manufactured, highly dramatic hysteria. "I am carrying your grandchild. I am pregnant. You cannot allow the mother of your only grandson to be locked inside a federal penitentiary. The stress of this ordeal is going to cause serious harm to the baby. We made a terrible, incredibly stupid mistake, but we are still a family. You have the legal power to halt this investigation right now. Please, Victor, for the sake of the innocent child, you have to show some human mercy and make these federal agents drop the criminal charges immediately." I stared at them both with an expression of pure, unadulterated ice. My heart did not soften at the desperate mention of the unborn child. It only hardened my absolute resolve to neutralize the toxic environment they had deliberately created. I reached inside my tailored jacket and slowly withdrew a thick, heavy manila envelope. Without speaking a single word, I opened the flap and began to lay the devastating physical evidence systematically onto the cold metal table. First came a series of high-resolution photographs detailing the specific chemical sedatives Priya had been secretly crushing into my evening meals. Second came the flawless printed copies of the wholly fabricated cognitive assessments signed by Dr. Kohler, clearly displaying their calculated intent to have me declared mentally incompetent. Finally, I placed down the heavily encrypted banking logs proving the $150,000 offshore wire transfer used to illegally bribe the gambling-addicted physician. The irrefutable proof of their profound calculated evil spread across the aluminum surface like a scattering of toxic ash. "You did not just attempt to rob me, Colton," I stated, my voice a deadly whisper that filled every corner of the cramped room. "You did not simply try to seize my corporate position. You deliberately poisoned my food. You tried to lock me inside a sterile asylum to rot for the remainder of my natural life, while you spent my entire legacy without hesitation." Colton stared at the damning photographs, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. The terrifying reality of his inescapable situation finally crushed what little hope remained. "What happens to us now?" he asked, his voice completely hollow and trembling with paralyzing dread. I reached into the very back of the heavy manila envelope and drew out two final, officially stamped legal documents. I slid them deliberately across the cold metal table until they came to rest, directly over the steel chains binding their wrists. "These are the formal, legally binding bankruptcy filings for your fraudulent company, Ridgeway Logistics," I declared coldly, watching his eyes widen in pure despair, "and resting directly beneath them is the immediate non-negotiable foreclosure notice for your stolen Nashville mansion." The suffocating silence inside the cold, sterile interrogation room stretched into an eternity. Colton stared blankly at the bankruptcy documents and the foreclosure notice resting on the scarred aluminum table. The undeniable proof of his total ruin lay directly over his chained hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, pathetic wheeze escaped his throat. Priya pressed her face into her shaking hands, her extravagant gown trembling with deep, convulsive sobs. I had nothing to say to her, no comfort, no final words. I turned away from both of them, the two people who had engineered my ruin, and moved toward the steel door with measured, deliberate steps, my shoes cutting sharp sounds against the bare floor. The lead federal agent stood waiting in the corridor outside, bathed in harsh, fluorescent light. A brief professional nod told me my 5 minutes had run their course. Behind me, the door sealed shut with a resonant finality that echoed through the sterile hallway, a sound that permanently closed my connection to the son I once raised. In the weeks that followed, the federal machinery ground forward with cold, unstoppable precision. The volume of airtight evidence we had delivered gave every defense attorney in the country exactly nowhere to stand. There was no softening of what came next. Colton and Priya faced a federal grand jury that indicted them on a stack of severe felony counts: large-scale interstate wire fraud, international money laundering, criminal corporate espionage, deliberate forgery of binding legal medical records, and a particularly targeted charge of conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The prosecutors moved without mercy, refusing every overture toward reduced charges or quiet resolutions. The presiding judge, facing defendants who had both corrupted the federal banking system and carried out a calculated domestic atrocity, extended them no leniency whatsoever. Both my son and his treacherous wife were staring down sentences that could reach 20 years inside a maximum security federal facility. Federal marshals descended on the Tennessee Hill Country estate and locked it down immediately. Every exotic vehicle, every piece of designer jewelry, every dollar of stolen corporate wealth was seized and converted, applied against the staggering fines and restitution demands the court imposed. They were left with absolutely nothing from their stolen life, only the long, cold corridor of incarceration stretching out ahead of them. I returned to the familiar towers of my corporate headquarters in Cleveland and set the final phase of my counteroffensive in motion. From my sunlit office on the 50th floor, I sat across the mahogany desk from Warren Falk, the sharpest and most loyal attorney I had ever employed. He had already assembled the full battery of legal instruments needed to excise my son from every corner of my life. One by one, I severed every bond, personal, financial, historical. Colton's name came off every corporate charter, every family trust, every founding document tied to Harmon Global Logistics. The erasure was surgical. I applied the precise, dispassionate efficiency he himself had used when he tried to bury me in a drugged stupor, turning his own method back on him. Every share, every dividend entitlement, every remnant of the executive standing he once held was revoked, notarized, and registered with the courts. He had forfeited the right to call himself my heir. As far as the legal record was concerned, he was no one. There was one thing I would not do, though. I refused to let the unborn child pay for its parents' crimes. I directed Warren to construct a new trust, sealed tight legally, impenetrable, completely beyond any reach Colton or Priya might ever attempt. The terms were absolute. Those funds could move only toward verified educational costs and necessary medical care. Warren Falk himself was named the sole trustee, the only human being authorized to administer a single dollar. Colton and Priya would have no sight of that money, no legal standing to request it, no mechanism to touch it. The child would grow up with a fully funded path forward, shielded entirely from the corrupting greed of the two people responsible for its existence. That was the full measure of what compassion remained in me. I was building a future for the innocent while engineering the permanent financial ruin of the guilty. From behind prison walls they would one day witness that child flourish and know they could never claim a fraction of it. Once the paperwork was executed, sealed, and consigned to the secure depths of my corporate archive, I walked out of that building for the last time in this chapter of my life. The ride to the private aviation terminal was silent. The customized Gulfstream sat ready on the tarmac engines, already turning their steady pitch, a sound I associated with freedom. Boone waited at the foot of the boarding stairs, unhurried, watchful, giving me a single nod as I reached him. I went up those stairs feeling nothing like the man who had been poisoned at his own dinner table. The manufactured haze that had pressed down on my mind for months on end had lifted, entirely burned away by the sharp, clean light of total vindication. I took the cream-colored leather seat beside the oval window. A flight attendant materialized with sparkling water in a crystal glass. I waved it off. What I needed was not refreshment. It was the silence of altitude and open sky. The jet rolled, gathered speed, and drove us upward into a clear afternoon. Through the thick oval glass, I watched the Nashville skyline contract and blur the glass towers, the grand estates, the geography of my son's betrayal, until all of it dissolved into haze at the edge of the horizon. I left it there. Every painful memory of what he had done receded with it, filed permanently into the closed chapters I no longer needed to open. A long, slow breath filled my lungs, cool, filtered cabin air that tasted like resolution. The empire I had spent a lifetime constructing was intact, untouched, and clean. The infected branch that had grown out of my own bloodline had been cut away for good. When the jet descended smoothly toward the Cleveland skyline, I felt the weight of that agonizing season lift from my shoulders completely. Tennessee and everything that had detonated there now belonged entirely to the past. Cataloged alongside the indictments, the bankruptcy filings, the evidence dossiers. A black town car collected me from the terminal and delivered me through the night to my heavily secured estate on the North Shore. The gates drew open and something settled in my chest, deep and wordless. I stepped out onto the drive, the gravel quiet beneath my shoes, and crossed into the bright foyer of my own house. The silence inside was a different kind entirely from the silence of that interrogation room. The house held no predators. Nobody was dissolving sedatives into food meant for me. No calculating heirs were convening in quiet rooms to map out my disposal. Every trace of that suffocating manipulative presence had been cut out at the root. I moved through the corridors I knew by memory and pushed open the heavy oak doors of my executive office. I crossed to the desk, lowered myself into the chair, and let the room hold me. The pewter lamp threw its soft glow across the clean surface. I leaned back and let my eyes close not from exhaustion, but from something closer to completion. I allowed the fact of my survival to settle fully into my body. For months I had sat inside a creeping doubt, asking myself whether what I was experiencing was the first collapse of a failing mind. My son and his wife had taken that fear and sharpened it into a weapon, wielding it against me with clinical precision in service of nothing but appetite. Yet I had not simply endured it. I had turned the full machinery of 3 decades of corporate combat directly onto the threat, and I had annihilated it. Not through sentiment, through the same cold, unsparing strategic intelligence that had built everything they tried to steal. I had handled my own bloodline the way I would handle a hostile corporate takeover, with cold precision and no room for sentiment. I opened my eyes and let my gaze settle on the slender silver frame positioned at the corner of my heavy desk. Inside it, my late wife Elaine was radiant, laughing in the warm sunlight during our 30th wedding anniversary. I reached out and traced a slow finger along the cool, polished edge, and a deep, quiet ache moved through my chest. Elaine and I had devoted our entire lives to assembling this corporate legacy piece by piece, nurturing a shared dream of the morning we would place it with confidence into our son's hands. We had made the costly mistake of believing that our unconditional love and our considerable wealth would form a barrier strong enough to keep corruption at a distance. What we never calculated was that the poison would not come from outside. It had taken root in his own character, nurtured entirely by his own appetite. Gazing at her face now, I made her a silent promise. What I had done was not the outcome either of us ever wanted. Cutting that connection from my life was its own kind of agony, but it was the only honest way to protect the empire we had built, together an empire she gave as much of herself to as I did. I drew my hand back from the frame and reached for the heavy crystal decanter sitting on its polished tray at the desk's edge. I worked the stopper free and poured a careful measure of aged single-barrel bourbon into a thickly cut crystal tumbler. The deep amber liquid caught the desk lamp's glow as it moved against the glass, slow and luminous. I raised the tumbler and took a long, unhurried sip. The bourbon traced a warm, welcome burn down my throat and spread across my chest, a grounded human sensation that cut against the absolute glacial composure I had held in place throughout every phase of this campaign. For the first time since this ordeal began in earnest, I let the hard shell around my chest ease just slightly. The corporate war had been won decisively and permanently. I set the tumbler down on its leather coaster and drew a heavy, embossed leather folder to the center of the desk. Warren Falk had made certain the finalized legal paperwork was secured and waiting ready for the final round of executive signatures. I opened the cover to expose crisp, freshly printed pages. The first document was a precisely drafted financial authorization, irrevocable and legally airtight, directing exactly $5 million from my primary holding accounts to a fully accredited, internationally recognized dementia medical research facility. A small dry smile moved across my lips as I reached for my platinum fountain pen. Colton and Priya had wielded the specter of cognitive decline as a weapon crafted specifically to dismantle my life. The deep irony was not lost on me that I was now directing serious capital toward fighting the exact disease they had performed so convincingly. Poetic justice has its own particular satisfaction. I put my name to the donation authorization in bold, completely steady strokes and set it aside. The second document waiting inside the folder carried the most weight of anything I would sign that evening. It concerned the living operational future of Harmon Global Logistics, a formal binding executive contract elevating Leland Brigg to the position of Chief Operating Officer. Leland had given this company more than 15 years of relentless, principled effort. He carried no family name, no biological claim, no inherited expectation, only the kind of consistent, honorable character that cannot be manufactured or purchased. By formally placing him in this role, I was sending a clear, unmistakable signal to the entire corporate world. True loyalty is not a birthright. It is built slowly through years of honest, dedicated work. It is earned, not assumed. I signed the executive contract with a depth of certainty I had not felt in years, locking in the prosperous future of everything I had spent a lifetime constructing. I set the platinum fountain pen back into its velvet-lined case and settled into the thick leather of my chair. I picked up the crystal tumbler and took another long, savoring pull of the aged bourbon. Before me, the magnificent Cleveland skyline blazed across the darkness, an entire city of light, holding steady against the night. I am exactly 70 years old today, and I am finally free. The grinding, destructive storm of treachery and manipulation has blown itself out entirely, and what it left in its wake is clear and open sky. The empire stands intact, protected from the rot that tried to hollow it out from the inside. The traitors who believed their greed would go unanswered have been removed permanently from everything they coveted. Sitting here in the deep, settled quiet of my sanctuary, I understand the truth with a clarity I could not have reached any other way. My life is completely and undeniably my own again, and it will remain mine to the final day. The most painful lesson any parent carries is the one that teaches you this blood is not a guarantee of loyalty, and loving without condition must never become the same thing as seeing without judgment. We dedicate our lives to constructing something worth passing on, always imagining we are building it for the ones we love. But there are seasons when the only way to protect what you built is to raise walls against the very people you raised. Grief is capable of transforming the children you nurtured into strangers, whose only true interest in you is the total figure in your accounts. Trust what your instincts are telling you. Never surrender your independence on the strength of someone else's reassurance. Pay close attention to what occurs beneath your own roof, and never stop asking questions. A genuine family honors your dignity and earns your trust through actions, not proximity. Those who meet in quiet corners and scheme against you have never respected anything about you except your net worth. The shadow you cast over their plans was the only thing standing between them and what they wanted. Remove that shadow, and they are exposed for exactly what they are. If you've stayed with me this far, then you already understand what this journey cost and what it finally gave back. I want to take a moment before we part ways. What happened to me was not just a theft of money or documents or a company name. It was an attempt to erase a person, to reduce a man who had built something real, something earned over decades, into a signature on a piece of paper, and then into nothing at all. I believe God kept my mind sharp precisely when the people closest to me were counting on it to fail. That is a mercy I do not take lightly. What carried me through was not rage. It was patience, clarity, and the refusal to confuse love with blindness. So here is what I would pass on to anyone listening tonight. Trust your instincts before you trust a smooth explanation. If something feels wrong inside your own house, it probably is. Never hand another person total control over your affairs without a safeguard that only you can trigger. Watch what the people around you do when they think the stakes are low. That is who they really are. And remember, loyalty that disappears the moment money enters the room was never loyalty to begin with. If this story moved, you leave a thought in the comments. I read them, and they mean more than you know. Share this with someone who might need to hear it tonight. And if you haven't already subscribed to Dad Revenge, so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.